We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Went wrong. The loss of the satellites, worth over £100 million, was a severe blow to NASA, sapping confidence in its ability to launch satellites safely using the Shuttle. Now special equipment has been developed to help rescue the satellites. It'll be the first time that a satellite captured in space has been returned to Earth. In the last few weeks, the satellites have had their orbit lowered and their rate of spin has been slowed down. The Indonesian Palapa satellite will be captured first. Using a jetpack, one of the astronauts, Fred Hawke, will approach with a 6-foot pole attached to him, poke it into the engine's casing and lock it into place. Then, using his jetpack, he will stop the spin. The shuttle will approach and the remote-controlled arm will grab the satellite with the astronaut still attached and pull them both towards the payload bay. 2 days later, the same procedure will be repeated to capture the Westar satellite. Once in the payload bay, they will be returned safely to Earth. The satellites belong to the insurers, who paid out over £100 million when they were lost. They'll be refurbished and sold. If successful, the rescue will be a dramatic demonstration of how useful man can be in space.
And finally, Madame Tussauds has marked Ronald Reagan's...
...was to rescue 2 stray satellites for the insurance group Lloyds of London. It'll also put 2 more satellites into orbit. And that's the news at 1 on...
...have forced a postponement of the launch of the American Space Shuttle Discovery. It's now due to lift off around lunchtime tomorrow. The 5 crew are starting an 8-day mission to rescue 2 stray satellites. And that was the 6 o'clock...
Launching satellites, the shuttle will also attempt to recover them. Our science correspondent James Wilkinson reports.
After a last-minute postponement yesterday because of high winds, today's launch went perfectly.
10, we're go for main engine start. 7, 6, we have main engine start. 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of Discovery and the first flight to retrieve and return satellites from space, and the shuttle has cleared the tower.
It's an 8-day mission. The 5-strong crew, including a woman astronaut, will launch 2 communication satellites and rescue 2 others. It'll be the first time that a satellite has been retrieved from space and brought back to Earth. The 2 satellites due for rescue were originally launched in February, but their engines misfired and both went into the wrong orbit. Watching the rescue from this room at the Space Center in Houston will be the insurance underwriter who paid for it, Stephen Merritt. Lloyds carried most of the insurance on the satellites. When they were lost, the underwriters paid out over £100 million. The rescue has cost them another £8 million. But if it's successful and the satellites can be refurbished and sold, they'll get back a good proportion of their money. Special equipment has been designed to carry out the rescue. An astronaut will approach the spinning satellite and insert a 6-foot pole into its engine nozzle. Once it is inside, the astronaut will pull a lever and 3 latches will spring out, capturing the satellite. Using his backpack, the astronaut will then stop the spin. The satellite will then be grabbed by the shuttle's remote-controlled arm and brought back to the shuttle. The procedure will be repeated with the 2nd satellite. Stephen Merritt has literally millions of his syndicate's money riding on this mission. For him, it'll be a nail-biting time.
I'm very optimistic. I don't think anybody can be totally confident, as it's nothing approaching it has been done before, but I'm very optimistic that we shall have a successful outcome.
For NASA too, the rescue is crucial. A successful outcome will restore confidence in the service it offers to its satellite customers.
And you can see more about Lloyd's financing of the satellite recovery on Commercial Breaks at 8 o'clock on BBC Two tonight.
The Pentagon has denied claims that U.S. warships have violated Nicaraguan territorial...
5 astronauts and 2 satellites on an 8-day mission. Jeremy Hands in London reports.
It may not look like it, but this is the space age equivalent of an RAC breakdown van. Discovery's mission is to rescue the 2 satellites that went spinning out of control on launch last February and to bring them back for the insurers who forked out £140 million.
Go for main engine start. 7, 6. We have main engine start. 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of Discovery and the first flight to retrieve and return satellites from space.
After yesterday's delay because of strong winds a long way up, all went smoothly today and Discovery's 5-man crew were blasted into orbit without a hitch. They will, during the next few days, locate the errant Palapa and Westar satellites, which embarrassingly chose their own course through space instead of the ones they were told to follow. Then, with the aid of jet backpacks, the crew will fly over, stop them spinning and bring them back on board. If all that goes well, the London insurer's bill will be almost halved. Even if the satellites come back for scrap only, there's enough titanium built into them to make that alone worthwhile. The shuttle will also launch 2 more satellites this trip that hopefully will behave better than their predecessors.
American Shuttle Discovery are about to try to make space history. 600 miles above Earth, they'll be attempting to retrieve a stray satellite for the first time. 2 have been stranded in useless orbit since February, and much of the money for the salvage operation has been put up by Lloyds of London, who hope to recoup space insurance losses by selling the satellites. Simon Cole reports on the operation, which will begin in about 15 minutes' time.
After a space chase of 1.5 million miles, the Discovery is within a few feet of the rogue satellite. Earlier, the astronauts relaxed. That orange globule is actually orange juice. Without gravity, not a drop is spilt. And astronaut Joe Allen was hamming it up. After countless jokes about his lack of height, he proved he can fit into a Discovery locker. The serious business will start in a few minutes' time, when Joe Allen will leave the craft with his backpack. Without a safety line, he'll attach a handle to the satellite using a machine called a stinger. Then the Discovery's mechanical arm will reach out and grab the satellite to store it in the cargo bay. During the 6-hour operation, Lloyds of London will be keeping a close watch on developments, together with those on the ground in Houston, including Kristin Fisher, whose mum Anna is one of the crew.
Astronauts on board the American Space Shuttle Discovery have been successful in their effort to recapture a stranded communications satellite from space. The operation to recover the satellite Palapa is going ahead now, and it's the most difficult and dangerous task which the shuttle's crew of 5 have to perform on this mission. But now they've run into trouble because the satellite won't fit into the payload bay. Our space editor, Reg Turnell, is watching the shuttle's progress from the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral and sent us this report.
Joe Allen and Dale Gardner were in their spacesuits well ahead of time, and just above Discovery, the Palapa satellite was spinning frighteningly fast. 300 kilometers above the Pacific, Joe set off rather like a matador and locked himself onto the satellite. Anna Fisher on the flight deck told him what to do next.
Okay, the wrench is broken over. Stop the clock.
Good work, cowboy, Joe told Anna as she grabbed Palapa and pulled it into the cargo bay. Then Dale Gardner used a pair of clippers bought in a Houston hardware store to saw Palapa's antenna. But then came trouble. So far, the arrangements for stowing it in the cargo bay just won't work, and the spacewalkers are in a lot of trouble. They seem to be getting very tired and may need another spacewalk to finish the job tomorrow.
Well, now to the vast country of India, where millions of pupils
from the Space Shuttle Discovery worked all afternoon to capture a communication satellite which went astray in February. Our science correspondent James Wilkinson reports.
The first part of the rescue went well. The crippled Palapa satellite was spinning slowly as the shuttle approached. Joe Allen set out from the payload bay with a 6-foot contraption called a Stinger strapped in front of him. As he disappeared behind the satellite for the rendezvous, he had one complaint: the sun was in his eyes. But he managed to insert the Stinger into the satellite's engine nozzle and locked onto it. Using the jet thrusters on his backpack, he stopped the satellite spinning. The remote-controlled arm then latched onto the Stinger and pulled the satellite towards the shuttle. Then things went wrong. As this animation shows, a bracket should have been fixed onto the other end of the satellite so the arm could lower it into the cradle. But the bracket... So the astronauts have been trying to manhandle the satellite into the payload bay. A short while ago, the astronauts reported that they have satellite berthed. But NASA are still holding their breath. They've got to do the same thing all over again with a second satellite on Wednesday.
Rescues in space. The inhabitants of one of Britain's most remote communities, the...
Allen, flying free from the Shuttle Discovery, recaptured the satellite which went astray last February and guided it back aboard. The operation was closely watched by the insurance underwriters Lloyds, who are paying NASA £10 million to rescue 2 satellites that went astray. The syndicates are hoping to resell them to recoup some of the £144 million they paid out. Lawrence McGinty's been watching the pictures here in London.
Astronauts Joe Allen and Dale Gardner carried some bizarre equipment on today's rescue mission. Allen, floating free and wearing a space scooter on his back, wielded an instrument called a Stinger, a kind of space fishing rod, to hook the Palapa satellite, which had been in the wrong orbit since it was launched by a space shuttle last February. While his colleague Gardner waited in the space shuttle's payload bay, Allen used the jets on his backpack to fly across to Palapa. As the morning sun flooded his spacesuit with light, he had a view of Detroit 200 miles below that few Americans have seen before. NASA had moved Palapa's orbit so the shuttle could catch up with it after a chase through space of 1.5 million miles. Allen and Gardner hoped to become the first astronauts ever to hook a satellite and bring it back to Earth in the payload bay. Lloyds paid out £70 million in insurance to the Indonesian government, who owned Palapa, and hoped to recover some of that outlay by repairing the satellite on Earth and selling what will probably be the world's first second-hand satellite. But first, Allen had to dock with Palapa.
And start the toggle. Stop dock, stop dock.
He'd done it. The Stinger had penetrated the exhaust of Palapa's jet booster. The end of the Stinger opened out like an umbrella and gripped the satellite so well, Allen could swing it round as easily as a baseball bat. Their next job was to inch Palapa into the payload bay. £1,500 of communication satellite swinging free in space. It all seemed to prove the point that man in space can be almost as at home as a fish in water. No doubt a point NASA will exploit in its arguments to get the finance for a space station. But once the astronauts had removed the Stinger that Allen had used to hook the satellite, there was, in NASA's words, a technical problem. The astronauts couldn't attach a clamp onto the satellite to allow the remote control arm to grasp Palapa. They improvised, one holding the satellite, the other attaching an adapter ring to lock the satellite in place in the hold. A few minutes ago, I spoke to Lloyd's underwriter Stephen Merritt at NASA in Houston.
I feel enormously relieved because there was a real difficulty with an unexpected piece of equipment, and the skill and the determination of the astronauts enabled them to use the contingency plans, and the satellite has been successfully secured.
What exactly was the problem?
The shape of the aerial, what you might describe as the lid on the top of the dustbin, was not exactly as expected, and therefore the clamping arrangements couldn't be made as intended. Therefore, they had to effectively manipulate the satellite by hand, and that was, they had a contingency plan for it, and they put that into effect, and it worked out.
One of the changes the Chancellor announced in his package was the scrapping.
Astronauts from the Shuttle Discovery worked all afternoon to capture a communications satellite which went astray in February. Our science correspondent James Wilkinson reports.
The first part of the rescue went well. The crippled Palapa satellite was spinning slowly as the shuttle approached. Joe Allen set out from the payload bay with a 6-foot contraption called a Stinger strapped in front of him. As he disappeared behind the satellite for the rendezvous, he had one complaint. The sun was in his eyes. But he managed to insert the probe into the satellite's engine nozzle and locked onto it. Using the jet thrusters on his backpack, he stopped the satellite spinning. The remote-controlled arm latched onto the Stinger and pulled the satellite towards the payload bay. Then problems. The astronauts couldn't use the arm to lower the satellite into its cradle in the payload bay. Instead, they had to manhandle it into its berth. One false move and it could have swung against the shuttle, perhaps damaging it. An adapter was bolted on. So far, so good, but NASA are still holding their breath. They've got to do it all over again with a second satellite on Wednesday.
Dale Allen's turn, seen here using a spanner to fly out tomorrow and capture the second satellite. Mission Control has just decided that yesterday's emergency procedure with the spacewalkers manhandling the satellite will have to be repeated tomorrow. Dangerous though it is, since once it starts moving, it's hard to stop and could easily crash into something. Joe didn't want to go through all this a second time, but has been told he must.
More Shuttle and news round about the same time tomorrow. Till then, bye-bye.
Astronauts aboard the American Space Shuttle Discovery achieved 2 space firsts this afternoon. They successfully recovered a rogue satellite, and one of them used his hands to maneuver it into the shuttle's hold after a mechanical failure. A group of underwriters led by Lloyds sponsored the rescue mission after they paid out £144 million when 2 satellites went into the wrong orbit earlier this year.
One keen observer of events in space was Kristin Fisher, whose mother Anna is one of the shuttle crew. Up above, astronaut Joe Allen tested his jetpack in the cargo bay with a contraption called the Stinger. This was to be put into the rogue satellite's exhaust. The satellite itself was spinning in a useless orbit only 35 feet away. It was nearly the end of a 1.5 million-mile space chase. With the right light conditions, Allen went to recover the satellite. You can see its reflections over astronaut Dale Gardner. 200 miles below is California and the Pacific.
Just to the west of Baja, California.
Astronaut Allen maneuvered into position behind the satellite. He was transformed into a brilliant white blob by the sunlight. Then the Stinger went in.
Dot, 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 dot.
Using his jetpack, Allen halted the satellite's rotation and began to steer it towards the shuttle. Discovery's robot arm groped towards the Stinger to lock on and guide it into the cargo bay, but things then went wrong. The robot arm didn't connect properly and only prodded the satellite towards Discovery. The astronaut switched to a backup plan. Man replaced machine.
Just hang on to it. Okay.
Joe Allen took the place of the arm and did hang on to the satellite, even manoeuvring it, while Dale Gardner tried to fit an adapter which would latch it into the cargo hold.
You earn your pay today.
In the weightlessness of space, Allen actually kept firm hold of the half-ton satellite for a complete orbit of Earth, yet another space first. After 5 hours, the 2 men tied the satellite down. The recovery mission over, Dale Gardner
orbit since February. On Monday, they successfully retrieved its sister satellite, Palapa. Jeremy Hans has been watching the latest pictures from space.
At the moment, the astronauts are manoeuvring their way towards the second and last of their 2 major recovery missions. This satellite, the West Star, was stranded in a useless orbit earlier on when it was launched in February. And now Dale Gardner, with his probe attached to his space chute, is moving out towards the satellite, as we see. The satellite has been brought to within 30 feet of Discovery, and before an hour or so is up, we think that this will be back on its way into the Discovery cargo hold.
New moves today in the controversy over whether doctors
Dramatic pictures from space of an historic satellite rescue. Hello, astronauts aboard the American Space Shuttle Discovery are putting the final touches to the world's first ever rescue mission in space. So far on this voyage, they've successfully recaptured 2 stranded satellites. On Monday, they caught the Palapa satellite, and now a second, called West Star, is being stowed away into the safety of Discovery's cargo bay. The 2 communication satellites cost a total of £58 million, but they misfired into the wrong orbits when they were launched 9 months ago and couldn't be used. Soon they'll be brought back to Earth, where any damage can be repaired. They can then be relaunched into space and used successfully. We've just received dramatic pictures showing today's recovery of West Star. It was caught by a harpoon-like machine, which is driven by astronaut Dale Gardner. Our space editor, Reg Turnell, reports now from Cape Canaveral.
This time we saw Dale Gardner firing his hand thrusters, lining up with West Star and driving home the harpoon. Joe Allen, standing on the tip of the robot arm, was pushed out by Anna Fisher, who was unseen on the flight deck, so that he could grab hold of West Star. Then, like playing a fish, Anna pulled them all to the safety of the cargo bay. And after that, there was another 2 hours of strenuous work, stowing West Star safely beside Palapa, which was recovered 2 days ago. And Discovery will bring its precious salvage, £58 million worth, back here to the Cape on Friday. Already, NASA is planning to repair and relaunch the first salvage satellite next year.
And another thrilling adventure in the skies has just ended.
First satellite on Monday. And at Lloyds of London, the underwriters rang the lutein bell twice to signal the successful salvage which they'd financed. James Wilkinson reports.
The rescue went like clockwork. This time, Dale Gardner strapped on the 6-foot so-called Stinger and went over to plug it into the slowly spinning satellite.
Hey, Toggle, they got it.
2 days ago, the astronauts succeeded in manhandling a similar satellite into the payload bay, even though that wasn't how they'd planned to do it. It went so well then, they decided on a similar approach today, this time with a little help from the remote-controlled arm. Joe Allen stood on the end of the arm and held the satellite, while Gardner worked on the other end. The rescue was finished an hour ahead of schedule. Both the satellites are now safely locked in position in the payload bay, ready for return to Earth. The insurers, Lloyds of London, originally paid out over £100 million when the satellites went into the wrong orbit in February. Insurance underwriter Stephen Merritt, who paid for the rescue, is now confident that his money was well spent. He watched the rescue from the Space Center in Houston. When the satellites are refurbished, they'll be sold, and the insurers will get much of their money back. To celebrate the success at Lloyd's today, the lutein bell was rung twice, signifying a successful salvage. The rescue was a remarkable achievement. The astronauts will get a hero's welcome when they return to Earth on Friday.
Report from our science correspondent, James Wilkinson. Well, in a few moments, the teenage girl who's spoken today for the first time.
Cargo bay. They've now rescued 2 satellites that were drifting uselessly in orbit since their rockets malfunctioned on launch and landed insurers in London with a multi-million-pound claim. News of the recovery was greeted with cheers at Mission Control in Texas and at Lloyds of London. The insurers hope to be able to sell the recovered satellites and recoup some of the money they had to pay out.
The space shuttle was manoeuvred into place with a series of short rocket bursts that allowed the rescue vehicle to overtake the spinning West Star satellite. On Monday, Discovery had successfully completed a similar rescue operation on West Star's sister satellite, Palapa. Spacewalkers Joseph Allen and Dale Gardner were wearing $2 million spacesuits and using a jet-propelled backpack and a high-technology grappling iron. Slowly, Dale Gardner made for the rogue satellite.
Westar was in a useless low orbit, but he managed to grab the cylindrical satellite and drag it back into the shuttle's cargo hold. Now, Westar and Palapa will be brought back to Earth to become the first reusable satellites in space. For the insurance underwriters, it all adds up to a spot of very good news. Lloyds of London and insurers in America stood to pay out $180 million to the owners of the two satellites. Now they hope to recoup some of that money. And this evening, at Lloyds, they were ringing the routine bell. It's usually rung twice for good news. Tonight, they thought the news was good.
And now economic and more business news. Figures out today.
The crew of America's Space Shuttle Discovery have scored a double success by retrieving the second of two communications satellites which had failed to get into proper orbit. James Wilkinson reports.
The rescue went like clockwork. This time, Dale Gardner strapped on the 6-foot so-called Stinger and went over to plug it into the slowly spinning satellite. He caught it first go.
Hey, Toggles, I got it.
2 days ago, the astronauts manhandled a similar satellite into the payload bay, even though that wasn't how they'd planned to do it. It went so well then, they decided on a similar approach today. Joe Allen stood on the end of the remote-controlled arm and held the satellite, while Gardner worked on the other end. Both the satellites are now safely locked in position in the payload bay, ready for return to Earth. The insurers, Lloyds of London, originally paid out over £100 million when the satellites went into the wrong orbit in February. Today, Lloyds celebrated the successful salvage by ringing the routine bell. The rescue was a remarkable achievement. The astronauts will get a hero's welcome when they return to Earth on Friday.
The news came through on Telex. The Lloyds chairman immediately announced silver merit medals for the astronauts. And the 18th century Lloyds routine bell, most well known for its ceremonial one ring when a vessel is lost at sea, was used to announce the spaceship's successful mission. 2 rings for good news. Discovery will bring the satellites back to Earth on Friday. Then Lloyds will be looking for buyers in the world's first used satellite sale.
In Afghanistan, the guerrillas strike and the Soviet MiGs hit back in revenge. A report next. Plus,
Completes its 3 million-mile flight around the Earth with a precision landing. The voyage has been rated a complete success with the first salvage operation in space. The astronauts brought back 2 expensive satellites which failed to go into their correct orbit when they were launched last February.
Back to Earth, making a perfect landing in Florida at dawn. 2 rogue satellites were rescued during the successful 2.5 million-mile journey and another 2 launched. The next flight, scheduled for January, will lift a secret Air Force satellite into orbit.
Has come to an end with a safe landing at Cape Canaveral. During a flight of more than 3 million miles, the crew rescued 2 space satellites. Our science correspondent, James Wilkinson, watched the touchdown.
After 8 days in space, the shuttle was coming home, mission accomplished. On board, the 2 communication satellites it rescued from orbit. Because of clouds at the Kennedy Space Center, the landing was nearly switched to the west coast of America. But the weather cleared just in time. Commander Rick Hawke brought Discovery down to a perfect landing.
We have touchdown.
The insurers had paid out over £100 million when the satellites originally went into the wrong orbit. Now they hope to get some of their money back. The first satellite rescued, Palapa, once it's refurbished, will probably be worth between 25 and 30 million pounds, a little less than when it was new. There have already been several buyers after it, even it's thought the original owners, the Indonesians. The other satellite, Westar, is worth a little less than Palapa because it's known there is some damage to it. Third world countries and some big companies are thought to be after this one. Whoever buys them, the insurance underwriters are well pleased with their investment of £8 million in the rescue. And for NASA, bringing them back has been a space first they'll be celebrating long into the night.